Hello everyone, welcome to True Chilling Tales. I've made this video to help you fall asleep. Before you do that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know what time it is with you and where you're watching from in the comments too. Now lay back, relax, and settle in for some chilling stories. I first spotted him at the grocery store, just another shopper among many. But then, he appeared at the gym, the coffee shop, and outside my apartment. A chill ran down my spine as I realized these sightings weren't random. The same face kept showing up everywhere I went, following a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. My heart raced as I wondered what this could mean, and why this stranger seemed to be shadowing my every move. The night was quiet as I pulled out of the parking lot, my shift finally over. The clock on my dashboard read 12:07 a.m. I yawned, already thinking about my bed waiting at home. That's when I first noticed the car. At first, it was just a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. But as I drove, those headlights stayed with me. The roads were nearly empty at this hour. Just me and that car behind me. I made a series of turns, each one confirming my growing suspicion. This car was following me. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles turning white. I couldn't shake the memory of a recent news story about night-stalking incidents in the area. The victims had all been driving home late, their situations eerily similar to mine. I glanced in my mirror again. The car maintained a steady distance, never trying to pass or fall back, just following. My heart raced, sweat beading on my forehead. I decided to test my suspicions. Up ahead was Elm Street. It didn't lead anywhere near my house, but it would tell me what I needed to know. I flicked on my turn signal and made the unnecessary turn. My breath caught as I watched my mirror. The car smoothly followed, making the same turn without hesitation. This wasn't a coincidence. This person, whoever they were, was following me intentionally. The precision of their movements, the way they matched my speed so perfectly, it was undeniable. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. Should I try to lose them? Head to a police station? As I debated my next move, the car behind me suddenly sped up, closing the distance between us. My stomach dropped. Whatever was going to happen, it was starting now. The suffocating panic of being hunted consumed me as the distance between our cars shrank. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, and my car lurched forward. The engine roared as I pushed it to its limits, but a glance in my rearview mirror made my heart sink. The headlights behind me grew larger, matching my every move with eerie precision. I took a sharp turn onto a narrow road, tires screeching in protest. The familiar glow of streetlights had long since faded, replaced by an oppressive blackness broken only by our headlights. With growing dread, I realized I had no idea where I was. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call for help or at least get my bearings. No signal. I was completely alone out here, cut off from any chance of rescue. Panic clawed at my throat, threatening to overwhelm me. Suddenly, the world behind me exploded into blinding white light. The car had switched on its high beams, filling my mirrors with a searing glare. I squinted, trying to maintain control as spots danced across my vision. In that moment of disorientation, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. The silhouette of the driver. It was just for a split second, but the image burned itself into my mind. A dark figure, hunched over the steering wheel, their features hidden in shadow. There was something unnatural about the outline that sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just some random creep following me home. This was something far worse. As my vision cleared, I spotted a small dirt road branching off to the right. Without thinking, I yanked the steering wheel, sending my car skidding onto the unpaved surface. The pursuing car's headlights disappeared for a moment, and I allowed myself a flicker of hope. But then I heard it. The roar of an engine and the crunch of gravel. They had followed me. I pushed my car to its limits, dodging potholes and low-hanging branches. The road twisted and turned, each bend bringing the fear that I might find myself trapped. But I kept going, driven by pure survival instinct. As I rounded another curve, my headlights illuminated something ahead, a structure of some kind. My heart leapt. Maybe it was a house, somewhere I could find help. But as I drew closer, that hope turned to ashes in my mouth. It wasn't a house at all, but an old abandoned warehouse looming in the darkness. And beyond it, I could see nothing but trees. I had driven myself right into a dead end. The abandoned warehouse loomed before me, a dark silhouette against the night sky. My headlights illuminated its weathered facade, revealing broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. I had driven myself right into a trap, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Behind me, the pursuing car's engine growled as it pulled in, its headlights flooding the area and casting long shadows across the overgrown lot. My hands shook as I frantically searched the car for anything I could use to defend myself. The glove compartment and under the seats yielded nothing but useless junk. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I heard car doors opening and closing, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on gravel. For a moment, everything fell silent. Then, a sharp tap on my window made me jump. A dark figure stood just inches away, barely visible in the glare of the headlights. My hand brushed against something solid under the passenger seat. Hope surged through me as I grabbed it and pulled it out. My heavy-duty flashlight, the one I kept for emergencies. The weight of it in my hand was reassuring. It wasn't much, but it was something. I gripped it tightly, my knuckles turning white. The flashlight, designed to withstand harsh conditions, felt sturdy enough to use as a weapon if needed. Another tap on the window, more insistent this time. I could hear my own ragged breathing in the confines of the car. The door handle jiggled, and I tensed, ready to strike if they managed to get in. In that moment, the flashlight became more than just a tool for illumination. It was my only line of defense, a potential lifesaver in this nightmare scenario. I realized that sometimes our best weapons are the ones we least expect. As I sat there, trapped and terrified, I couldn't help but wonder, would this ordinary object be enough to save me from whatever waited outside? Or had I just prolonged the inevitable? They say the darkest hour is just before dawn. For me, that darkness was a shadow falling across my driver's side window. I held my breath, flashlight clutched tightly. This was it. The moment of truth. The door handle jiggled. My heart hammered. I raised the flashlight, ready to strike. But as the handle moved a third time, something inside me snapped. In a burst of adrenaline, I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I slammed the gear into reverse. The tires spun on loose gravel, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was stuck. Then the car lurched backward. I caught a glimpse of the stalker jumping away. I cranked the wheel hard, praying I wouldn't flip. The world spun as I swerved around their car. Metal screeched as my side mirror clipped theirs. I floored it onto the dirt road. Trees whipped by in a dark blur. Every few seconds, I glanced in my mirrors, terrified I'd see headlights gaining on me. But the road behind stayed dark. As I reached the main road, the reality of what just happened hit me. The stalker had been close enough to touch my car door. If I'd hesitated for even a second longer, my heart was still racing, hands shaking on the wheel. But with each mile, a tiny spark of relief grew. I'd escaped. I wasn't going home, not until I was sure I was safe. I kept driving, the glow of dawn just starting to tinge the horizon. My eyes darted between the road ahead and my rearview mirror. The flashlight lay on the passenger seat, a silent reminder of how differently things could have gone. As the sky lightened, I made a decision. I needed help. With a deep breath, I turned onto the road that would take me to the police station. It was time to tell my story and make sure this never happened to anyone else. The police station's bright lights illuminated the parking lot as I pulled in, my nerves still on edge. I stepped out, legs unsteady. As I approached the entrance, something made me turn back. My heart raced as I spotted a perfect handprint on my driver's side window. The realization of how close my stalker had been hit me like a punch to the gut. Inside, I shared my experience with a sympathetic officer. Her eyes grew serious as I finished. "Trust your instincts," she said firmly. Those words lingered in my mind as I left the station, a mix of relief and unease washing over me. I had escaped a potentially dangerous situation, but the memory of that handprint kept me on high alert. Last fall, I decided to go camping one last time before winter set in. It was supposed to be a short, peaceful trip, a way to enjoy the changing leaves and clear my head before the snow came and made camping impossible with my current gear. I chose a remote valley I'd been wanting to explore for a while. The plan was simple: hike to a campsite, set up my tent, and then bushwhack to a couple of alpine lakes I'd seen on the map about 3 kilometers away. It sounded perfect in theory. A solo trip, no one else around, just me and the wilderness. Exactly what I needed. The day started out great. The drive to the trailhead was quiet, and when I parked my car and looked around, I didn't see another soul. I had that exhilarating feeling of being completely alone in nature. By the time I hit the trail, it was late morning, and the cool autumn air felt refreshing. I could hear birds chirping in the distance and the crunch of leaves under my boots. It was perfect. I took my time hiking to the campsite. The trail was well marked, and I stopped frequently to take photos and enjoy the scenery. The valley was stunning, with golden leaves carpeting the forest floor and the occasional break in the trees, revealing glimpses of the rugged mountains surrounding me. I felt like I had the whole world to myself. But because I took so many detours and stopped to explore a couple of side trails, I didn't reach my campsite until much later than I'd planned. The sun was already starting to dip behind the mountains, and the temperature was dropping quickly. I quickly set up my tent, threw my gear inside, and decided to head straight for the lakes before it got too dark. I wasn't nervous at first. Sure, this was bear country, but I'd hiked solo plenty of times before. I knew the drill. Make noise, stay aware, and keep your distance if you see anything. So, as I left the campsite and started heading toward the lakes, I began calling out, "Hey ho!" every few minutes. just to let any wildlife know I was there. It felt a little silly at first, but it's one of those things you do out of habit when you're hiking alone. The first part of the route was easy. There was a faint path leading into the woods, and I followed it for about a kilometer before it disappeared into dense trees. From there, I had to bushwhack my way through the undergrowth, using my map and compass to stay on course. It was slow going, and as the forest grew thicker, the light began to fade faster than I'd expected. I called out, "Hey ho!" again, louder this time, just in case. That's when I heard it. "Hey ho!" It was a woman's voice, clear and loud, coming from somewhere behind me. My first thought was relief. Maybe there was another hiker out here. But when I turned around, there was no one there. The forest was still, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, but no movement, no sound. I frowned, trying to figure out where the voice had come from. "Hello?" I called, scanning the trees. No response. I stood there for a moment, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, rustling, anything. But the forest was completely silent. My heart started to race. It didn't make sense. The voice had been so clear, so close. I'd hiked enough to know how sound carries in the woods, and this wasn't an echo. Someone had called back to me. Feeling uneasy, I decided to keep moving. Maybe it was another hiker, and they just didn't want to be seen. People can be weird sometimes, right? I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached the lakes, I felt a small sense of relief. The view was breathtaking. The water was crystal clear, reflecting the fiery red and orange leaves of the trees around it. But the feeling of unease lingered. I couldn't enjoy the beauty of the moment because I couldn't shake the thought of that voice. I didn't stay long. The sun was dipping lower, and I didn't want to be in the woods after dark. As I started back down the trail, the forest felt different. Darker, quieter. I kept calling out, "Hey ho!" every few minutes. But this time, I didn't hear anything back. Maybe that should have made me feel better, but it didn't. Instead, it just made me more aware of how alone I was. About halfway back to the campsite, I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but I suddenly had the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. I picked up my pace, walking as fast as I could without breaking into a run. My flashlight was in my pack, but I didn't want to stop to get it. The last bit of sunlight was fading fast, and I could barely see the trail in front of me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I would see someone, or something, standing there. When I finally made it back to the campsite, it was almost completely dark. I felt a wave of relief when I saw a couple of other tents set up nearby. A group of campers had arrived while I was gone, and the sound of their voices and laughter made me feel a little less on edge. I walked over to them, trying to act casual, and asked if they'd seen anyone else on the trail. Maybe it was one of them who'd called back to me earlier, but they all shook their heads. One of them even said, "We came in over the ridge. If anyone else was out there, we would have seen them." That's when it hit me. To get to the part of the valley I was in, you either had to pass through the campsite or cross over some serious mountain passes. There was no easy way in. If someone had been out there, they would have had to hike out in complete darkness, or they were still out there, somewhere in the woods. I didn't sleep much that night. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race, and I kept replaying that voice in my head. It was so loud, so close. I still don't know who or what called back to me that day, but I haven't hiked solo since. A few years ago, my friend and I went hiking in the mountains, one of those challenging but beautiful trails with amazing views of the valley below. We'd spent the whole day exploring, taking in the scenery, and by the time we started heading back, the light was starting to fade. As we made our way down, we decided to split up and take two different routes to see which one was faster. I took the cliffside trail, a narrow, rocky path that hugged the edge of the valley. It wasn't an easy route, but I loved the challenge, and the views were incredible. The air was crisp, the sun was setting, and I was feeling good. I figured I'd meet up with my friend at the trailhead in about an hour. About halfway along the trail, I spotted someone ahead of me. At first, I thought it was just another hiker. They were standing on the path, facing out toward the valley, not moving. From a distance, it looked like they were admiring the view, so I didn't think much of it. I kept walking, closing the gap between us. But as I got closer, something about them seemed off. They weren't standing naturally. Their posture was stiff, almost rigid, like they were waiting for something. I slowed down, unsure whether to call out. Then, as if sensing me, they turned. It wasn't a quick glance or a casual turn. It was slow, deliberate. They didn't say anything, just stared at me. Even from a distance, I could tell something wasn't right. Their face was shadowed by the dim light, but their body language felt wrong, not like a normal hiker. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound casual, even though my heart was starting to race. "Beautiful day, huh?" They didn't respond. They didn't move. They just stood there, staring. I stopped in my tracks. I didn't know what to do. The trail was too narrow to go around them, and turning back meant climbing a steep section I'd just come down, a section I wasn't eager to tackle again. But staying where I was felt even worse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they turned again and started walking away. Slowly, almost like they were daring me to follow. I stood there, debating whether to keep going. The rational part of me thought, they're probably just a weird hiker. Don't overthink it. But the pit in my stomach told me something was seriously wrong. Against my better judgment, I decided to keep going. I figured if I stayed far enough behind, I could avoid them. Besides, the trail wasn't that long. If I could just get past this stretch, I'd be back on the main path soon. But as I walked, they stayed in sight. They didn't speed up or slow down. They just kept walking at the same steady pace, always a little too close for comfort. Every few minutes, they would stop and turn around, like they were checking to see if I was still there. I started to feel trapped. The trail was too narrow to pass them, and the cliffs on either side made it impossible to go off trail. I kept walking, trying to act like I wasn't bothered, but my heart was pounding harder with every step. Then they stopped completely. I froze, about 30 feet behind them, waiting to see what they would do. Slowly, they turned again, this time stepping off the trail and onto a rocky outcrop that jutted over the valley. For a second, I thought they were going to jump. Or worse, that they were waiting for me to pass so they could follow me. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can I get by?" They didn't respond. They just stood there, staring down into the valley. At this point, every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. I turned around and started climbing back up the trail, as fast as I could without losing my footing. The rocks were loose, and my legs were shaking, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. As I climbed, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The figure was still standing there, watching me. They didn't move, but their presence felt heavy, like they were waiting for the right moment. By the time I reached the main trail, I was out of breath and drenched in sweat. I found a spot near the junction and sat down, trying to calm my racing heart. I didn't care if it made me look paranoid. I wasn't going anywhere until my friend showed up. When they finally arrived, I practically sprinted over to them, babbling about what had happened. We both looked back toward the cliffside trail, but there was no sign of the person. They were gone. To this day, I don't know what their deal was. Maybe they were just a weird hiker, or maybe they had other intentions. All I know is that I've never felt that kind of unease on a trail before, or since. Last summer, I decided to take my 2 kids, aged 3 and 5, on a hiking trip in the Utah desert. It was supposed to be a fun day of exploring, nothing too intense. We'd packed snacks, water, and everything we needed for a simple, family-friendly outing. The plan was to hike for a few hours, have lunch near the canyon, and then head back to the truck before the midday heat got too intense. The trailhead was in a remote area, miles down a rough dirt road. There wasn't a single car in sight when we arrived, which I thought was perfect. I wanted us to have the place to ourselves. After unloading the kids and securing the truck, we started off on the trail. The hike out was uneventful, just the way I'd hoped. The kids were excited, pointing out rocks, lizards, and other desert oddities. We took it slow, letting them explore. I kept an eye on the sky, making sure we didn't lose track of time. By the time we reached the canyon, they were starting to get tired, so I figured we'd rest for a bit before heading back. After about an hour, we packed up and started the return hike. As we got closer to the trailhead, I spotted something strange in the distance. There was a figure near the truck. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, but as we got closer, I could see them moving around the truck, peeking into the windows, crouching to look underneath, and eventually climbing into the bed. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing across the desert. "Get away from my truck!" The figure didn't move. My stomach dropped. I couldn't make out their face, but their posture was tense, almost defiant. They were waiting, watching. I grabbed my kids' hands and kept walking, trying to stay calm. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was someone lost or in need of help. But why would they be messing with the truck like that? I kept shouting, hoping to scare them off, but they stayed put. As we got within half a mile, I noticed something glinting in their hand. A knife. They weren't just lurking. They were actively doing something to the truck. My heart sank as I realized the situation was worse than I'd thought. We were miles from anyone, completely isolated, and now potentially stranded. "Stay here," I told the kids, pulling them behind a large rock for cover. I always carried a gun on hikes, and this was one of those moments I was glad I had it. I pulled it out and fired a warning shot into the air. The figure immediately jumped out of the truck bed. Instead of running away, they turned and made a sweeping motion toward the tires, like they were taunting me. Then, without a word, they started walking away into the desert. I waited until they were completely out of sight before approaching the truck. My worst fears were confirmed. All 4 tires were slashed, and the fuel tank in the bed had been stabbed open. Gasoline was leaking everywhere. We were stranded. I pulled out my phone, praying for service. Miraculously, I had 1 bar. I called 911, trying to keep my voice steady while explaining the situation. As I talked to the dispatcher, I glanced up and saw the figure again. This time, they were walking back toward us. "Please hurry," I told the dispatcher. "He's coming back." The next 10 minutes felt like an eternity. I kept the kids hidden, watching as the figure moved closer. Finally, the sound of sirens broke the silence. 2 police vehicles pulled up, their lights flashing. The man turned and bolted, disappearing into the vast expanse of the desert. The officers chased him on foot, but couldn't catch him. They even called in a search plane, but he was gone, lost in the maze of canyons and cliffs. We later learned he'd been living in an abandoned ghost town nearby, targeting hikers in the area. It took 2 years for him to be caught, and even now, I can't shake the memory of how close we came to real danger. It was early morning when my friends and I set out on a mountain trail we'd been planning to hike for months. The kind of place people rave about. The scenery, the clean air, the panoramic views from the summit. The forecast had been promising, but as we started climbing, a heavy fog rolled in. Not the light, misty kind you see in movies. This was thick, dense fog that swallowed everything around it. At first, it was almost fun. The trail felt mysterious, the way it snaked through the trees, with the fog creating an otherworldly atmosphere. We joked about being in a horror movie, half laughing as we squinted to see the trail markers.
It wasn't long before we noticed the figure.
We'd been walking for about an hour when my friend Anna spotted it first. "Hey, look," she said, pointing ahead. Through the fog, we could just make out the outline of a person. They were standing perfectly still, right in the middle of the trail. Their hood was up, and they didn't seem to notice us. "Probably another hiker," I said, shrugging it off. "They're probably waiting for us to pass." We called out, just a friendly, "Hello!" But the figure didn't move. They didn't even turn to look. After a few seconds, they slowly walked off down the trail, disappearing into the fog. "Okay, that was weird," Anna muttered. We laughed it off and kept walking, but the encounter left an odd feeling in the air. The fog made it impossible to see more than 10 feet ahead, and every time the trail turned, we half expected to see the figure again. And then, we did. It was Anna who noticed them again, standing ahead on the trail, still as a statue. They were closer this time, and we could make out more details. The dark hoodie, the way their head seemed slightly tilted, as though they were listening. They stood there for what felt like forever, watching us, before turning and walking away again. At this point, we were starting to feel uneasy. "What's their deal?" Anna asked. "Why don't they say anything?" "Maybe they're just shy," I offered, though I didn't believe it. Something about their movements, the way they seemed to appear and disappear, felt off. The third time we saw them, we stopped walking. This time, they were even closer, standing just a few feet away, their hooded figure blending almost perfectly with the gray fog. They didn't move. They didn't even seem to breathe. We called out again, "Hey, are you okay?" but the figure just stood there. Finally, Anna stepped forward. "Enough of this," she muttered. But as soon as she moved, the figure turned and walked away, their movements slow and deliberate, like they were taunting us. At this point, the jokes stopped. The trail felt oppressive, the silence heavy. Every sound, the crunch of our boots, the rustle of leaves, seemed amplified. And the fog, which had felt magical at first, now felt suffocating. We tried to pick up the pace, but the figure kept appearing, always just far enough ahead to keep us on edge. Once, we thought we'd lost them, but as we turned a corner, there they were again, standing off the trail, half hidden by a tree. They didn't follow us. They didn't run. They just waited. When we reached a clearing, we stopped to catch our breath. "This is ridiculous," Anna said, her voice shaky. "I say we turn back." "Turn back to what?" I asked. "They're behind us too." We stood there in silence, realizing the truth. No matter where we went, this figure was always there, always watching. The realization made my stomach churn. Who were they? And what did they want? We pressed on, desperate to put distance between us and the figure. But the further we went, the heavier the fog seemed to get. The air felt colder, damper, like the mountain itself was closing in on us. And then we noticed something even worse. One of us was missing. "Where's Liam?" Anna asked, her voice rising in panic. We stopped in our tracks, scanning the trail. Liam had been right behind us just a minute ago, but now he was gone. We called his name, our voices echoing uselessly into the fog. I felt a knot of dread in my chest as I realized he hadn't said anything. No shout, no warning. He was just gone. We backtracked, calling his name over and over. The figure didn't reappear, but the oppressive silence made every step feel unbearable. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just by the figure, but by the mountain itself. The fog seemed alive, shifting and swirling around us, hiding things we couldn't see. Finally, we reached a point where we had to stop. Anna was shaking, her face pale. "He's not here," she whispered. "He's not anywhere." We returned to the trailhead hours later, exhausted and terrified. We reported Liam missing to the rangers, but they never found him. No sign of his gear, his footprints, nothing. It was as if the mountain had swallowed him whole. And as for the figure, we never saw them again. But every time I think about that hike, I can't help but wonder, who or what were they? And what happened to Liam? I've always loved solo hiking. There's something about being out there alone, surrounded by nature, with nothing but the sound of your boots crunching on the trail. It's peaceful, almost meditative. At least, that's how I felt before this trip. It was supposed to be a straightforward hike, just a few days in the backcountry, following a well-marked trail to a remote campsite. I'd done hikes like this plenty of times before, and I liked the challenge of being completely self-reliant. The forecast was good, the trail was clear, and I was looking forward to the solitude. The first day was uneventful. The trail wound through dense forest, with occasional clearings that offered glimpses of the mountains in the distance. I set a steady pace, stopping only to snap a few photos or take a sip of water. By the time I reached my first campsite, the sun was dipping below the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I set up my tent, made dinner, and settled in for the night. That's when I first heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a faint, whispering sound that seemed to rise and fall with the breeze. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing. But as I sat there, stirring my dinner over the small camp stove, the whispers grew louder. They weren't random noises. They were words. Faint, indistinct, but unmistakably words. I froze, straining to hear. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. The whispers stopped. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. It was probably just the wind, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. I was tired from the hike, and the forest had a way of amplifying every little sound. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispers again. Faint and distant at first, but slowly growing louder. They seemed to come from all around me, circling my tent. I sat up, clutching my flashlight, and shone it through the thin fabric. Nothing. Just the trees, swaying gently in the breeze. By morning, I was exhausted, but I convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Sleep deprivation, the wind, my overactive imagination. It had to be something like that. I packed up my gear and hit the trail, determined to put some distance between myself and whatever had spooked me. But the whispers followed me. At first, they were faint, like before, barely audible over the sound of my boots crunching on the trail. But as the day went on, they grew louder, closer. I stopped several times, spinning around to look behind me, but the trail was empty. No sign of another hiker, no rustling in the bushes. Just the whispers. They seemed to be coming from the trees, from the very forest itself. Sometimes they were indistinct, just faint murmurs I couldn't quite make out. Other times, I swore they were calling my name. "Megan," they whispered, soft and drawn out. "Megan." My heart pounded every time I heard it. I tried to keep moving, but my legs felt heavy, my breath coming in short gasps. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful the day before, now felt suffocating. The trees pressed in on either side, their branches twisting together like they were trying to trap me. By the time I reached the second campsite, I was a wreck. My hands were shaking as I set up my tent, and I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. The whispers hadn't stopped, but they seemed quieter now, like they were waiting. I sat by the fire, clutching a mug of tea, trying to calm myself down. "You're overthinking this," I told myself out loud. "It's just your imagination. You're tired. That's all." The forest didn't answer, but the whispers started up again, faint and distant. They didn't seem to come from any particular direction this time. They were just there, all around me. When I finally crawled into my tent, I made sure to zip it up tight, even though I knew that wouldn't stop anything. I lay there in the dark, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for the whispers to start again. But they didn't. Not at first. Instead, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. crunching softly on the leaves outside my tent. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The steps stopped just outside, and I swore I could hear breathing, low, heavy, and deliberate. I gripped the knife I always kept by my sleeping bag, my knuckles white. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No response. The whispers started again, louder this time. They seemed to come from directly above me, like they were floating in the air. "Megan," they called, soft and insistent. "Megan!" I snapped. Grabbing my flashlight, I unzipped the tent and shone the beam into the darkness. The forest was empty. The whispers stopped. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scanned the trees, looking for anything, anyone, that could explain what was happening. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, jumping at every sound. By the time the sun rose, I'd made up my mind to leave. I didn't care how far I had to hike. I just wanted out. The whispers followed me all the way back to the trailhead. By the time I reached my car, I was shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove away as fast as I could, glancing in the rearview mirror the whole time, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing at the edge of the forest. I still don't know what I heard out there. Was it the wind? My imagination? Something else? All I know is that I haven't hiked solo since. There's something oddly comforting about hiking with friends. You feel safer, like the collective presence of a group somehow shields you from the dangers of the wild. That's what I thought when we set out on this trip. A simple weekend hike with a couple of my closest friends. It was supposed to be an easy trek. 2 days, 1 night, and a well-traveled loop trail. But we got cocky. And that's when things went sideways. We were making great time on the first day, chatting and laughing as we walked through a dense forest of tall pines. The air was cool, and the golden light of late afternoon filtered through the trees. We weren't in any rush, which was our first mistake. By the time we reached the halfway point, where we were supposed to camp for the night, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. That's when we found the shelter. It wasn't on the map, but it seemed like a godsend. A small wooden cabin, weathered but still intact, tucked away off the trail. It looked abandoned, but the door was unlocked, and the inside was surprisingly clean. There was a fireplace, a couple of benches, and enough floor space for all of us to sleep comfortably. We joked about how lucky we were to find it, calling it our luxury suite in the woods. As night fell, we lit a small fire in the fireplace and cooked dinner. The warmth and light made the cabin feel cozy, almost homey. We talked for hours, sharing stories and laughing until we were too tired to stay awake. One by one, we rolled out our sleeping bags and settled in for the night. That's when the noises started. At first, it was subtle, a faint creaking, like the sound of someone stepping on loose floorboards. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe the old cabin settling. But then I heard it again, louder this time. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, sitting up in my sleeping bag. One of my friends, Sarah, nodded. "Yeah, it's probably just an animal outside." "On the floorboards?" I asked. The room fell silent as we all listened. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving across the cabin, but there was no one there. We grabbed our flashlights and shone them around the room. The beams of light illuminated the walls, the ceiling, the corners. Nothing. But the footsteps continued, circling the room, always just out of sight. "I'm not staying here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. She started packing up her sleeping bag, but I stopped her. "Where are you going to go? It's pitch black out there." As if on cue, there was a loud bang, like something heavy had slammed against the outside wall. We all jumped, our flashlights darting toward the source of the noise. The sound came again, this time from the opposite wall. It was as if something, or someone, was surrounding the cabin. We huddled together in the center of the room, clutching our flashlights like they were the only things keeping us safe. The footsteps started again, this time coming from above us. I tilted my flashlight upward, and my stomach dropped. There was a hatch in the ceiling, a small, square door we hadn't noticed before, and it was open. Did that door open on its own?" one of my friends whispered. Before I could answer, we heard a loud crash from outside. It sounded like something had fallen, a branch maybe, but the sound was followed by another, and another, like footsteps stomping around the cabin. "Grab your stuff," I said. "We're leaving." We scrambled to pack up our gear, our hands shaking as we tried to roll up our sleeping bags and stuff them into our packs. The footsteps grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was outside knew we were trying to leave. We burst out of the cabin and onto the trail, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we ran. The forest seemed darker than it had before, the trees towering over us like shadowy sentinels. We didn't stop running until we were miles away, back on the main trail. Only then did we turn around, shining our flashlights into the darkness. The cabin was nowhere to be seen. The rest of the hike was a blur. We didn't talk much, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we finally made it back to the car, we threw our packs in the trunk and drove away in silence. To this day, I don't know what we experienced in that cabin. I've tried looking for it on maps, but it's like it never existed. Whatever it was, I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps, or the feeling that we were being watched. I've always been someone who looks for shortcuts, whether it's shaving a few minutes off my commute or finding an easier way to finish a project. I can't help but think, what's the fastest way to get this done? That mindset has served me well in everyday life, but it nearly cost me everything during a hiking trip last summer. It was supposed to be a simple day hike. The trail was about 12 miles round trip, with a beautiful viewpoint halfway through that overlooked a crystal clear lake. I'd planned it out perfectly. Leave early, hit the viewpoint by lunch, and be back at the trailhead before the sun dipped too low. Everything was going fine until I hit the halfway point. The viewpoint was breathtaking, just like everyone said it would be. I sat there for a while, eating my sandwich and staring out at the lake below, the sun reflecting off its surface like a mirror. But as I packed up my things and started heading back, I noticed something on my map. A faint, unmarked trail branching off from the main one. Now, I knew better. Unmarked trails are unmarked for a reason, but this one looked like it headed straight down to the lake, cutting out a huge switchback section of the main trail. It would save me at least an hour, maybe more. I stood there for a few minutes, debating. The trail was narrow, but visible, and it didn't look too overgrown. I decided to go for it. At first, everything was fine. The trail was steep, but manageable. It wound through a dense patch of forest, the air cool and damp under the canopy of trees. I could hear the distant sound of the lake's waves lapping against the shore, and I felt confident I was headed in the right direction. But about half an hour in, The trail started to change. The ground became uneven, the dirt loose and slippery. The trees grew closer together, their branches reaching out like fingers, snagging at my clothes and backpack. I told myself it was just a rough patch. If I kept going, the trail would even out again. It didn't. The trail disappeared completely, swallowed up by the forest. I stopped, looking around for any sign of a path. Trampled grass, broken branches, anything. There was nothing. Just dense undergrowth and trees as far as the eye could see. I pulled out my map, trying to orient myself, but it was useless. The unmarked trail wasn't on it, and I had no idea where I'd gone wrong. I thought about turning back, retracing my steps to the main trail, but when I looked behind me, the path I'd been following was gone. It was like the forest had closed in around me, erasing any sign of where I'd come from. My chest tightened as panic started to set in. I wasn't lost. Not yet, I told myself. I still had my bearings. The lake was downhill, and if I just kept moving in that direction, I'd find it. Once I reached the lake, I could follow the shoreline back to the main trail. I pushed forward, hacking my way through the undergrowth with a stick I'd found. The forest was eerily quiet. The only sounds the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional snap of a branch. Every now and then, I'd hear something. Movement in the bushes, the rustle of leaves. But when I stopped to listen, the sound would disappear. After what felt like hours, I finally broke through the trees and stumbled onto a clearing. At first, I thought I'd made it to the lake, but as I looked around, I realized I was standing in front of a cabin. It was small, almost a shack, with weathered wood and a roof covered in moss. The windows were dark, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. There was no sign of a path leading to or from it, no evidence that anyone had been there recently, or ever. I should have turned around. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, but I was exhausted, and the cabin offered some small sense of safety, a reprieve from the oppressive forest. I stepped closer, peering through the open door. The inside was dark, but not completely empty. There was a table in the center of the room, its surface covered in dirt and leaves. A single chair sat beside it, tipped over on its side. On the far wall, there was a fireplace, its hearth cold and empty. The whole place smelled of damp wood and decay. I stepped inside, my boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. I called out, "Hello?" But my voice sounded weak, swallowed up by the cabin's silence. I didn't plan to stay long. I just needed a moment to catch my breath and figure out my next move. But as I stood there, I noticed something on the table. A piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was blank, except for a single word scrawled in the center. Leave. My stomach dropped. The word wasn't written in ink. It looked like it had been scratched into the paper with something sharp, the edges of the letters jagged and uneven. My first thought was that someone was playing a prank, but there was no one out here. Who would go to the trouble of leaving something like this in the middle of nowhere? That's when I heard it. A faint sound coming from outside. It was soft at first, like the creak of a branch, but it grew louder, closer. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, circling the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the cabin was empty. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, stumbling out into the clearing. The forest was still and silent, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from somewhere in the trees. I didn't stop running until I was miles away, back on the main trail. When I finally reached the trailhead, I collapsed against my car, gasping for air. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if something or someone had followed me. To this day, I don't know what I stumbled into out there. I've tried to find that cabin on maps, but it's like it never existed. All I know is that I'll never take another shortcut again. Some hiking trips are about the views, others are about the challenge, and a few, like this one, become unforgettable for reasons you wish weren't real. It was supposed to be a simple overnight hike, something to stretch my legs and enjoy the cool air of early autumn. The plan was straightforward. Hike to a ridge that overlooked the valley, camp under the stars, and head back down in the morning. Simple, right? I reached the ridge just before sunset, with enough time to set up camp and enjoy the view. The valley stretched out below me, a patchwork of dense forest and meandering streams. The air was crisp, and the fading sunlight bathed everything in a warm, golden glow. It was the kind of scene that made all the effort of the hike worth it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit a small campfire and cooked dinner. The world around me grew darker, the sky filling with stars. Out here, away from the city, the night sky was breathtaking. I leaned back against my pack, staring up at the Milky Way, feeling completely at peace. That peace didn't last. It started with a light in the distance, faint but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was a plane, a single bright point moving steadily across the sky. But as I watched, it slowed down, stopped. Then it began to move in a way that planes don't. It zigzagged, darting back and forth, and then shot upward at an impossible speed before stopping again. I sat up, my heart pounding. What the hell? I muttered to myself. It had to be a drone, right? Some hobbyist messing around in the woods? But who would be flying a drone this far out, in the middle of nowhere, at night? I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was nothing to worry about. But then another light appeared, and another. Soon, there were 3 of them, moving in unison, weaving through the sky like they were dancing. They were too far away to make out any details, but they were bright, brighter than any stars, and they moved with an eerie precision. I stood up, my hands clenching into fists. The lights hovered for a moment, then began to descend. Slowly, steadily, they moved closer to the ridge. My campfire flickered in the breeze, casting shadows that danced across the rocks. The lights were almost hypnotic, their movement smooth and deliberate. And then they stopped. They hung in the air, just above the tree line, perfectly still. The forest below was silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. That's when the sound started. It was faint at first, a low hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It grew louder, more insistent, like the whine of a jet engine ramping up. I covered my ears, but the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside my head. It felt like it was burrowing into my skull, filling every corner of my mind. I stumbled backward, tripping over a rock and landing hard on the ground. The lights began to pulse, their brightness intensifying with each beat of the hum. I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was stare as the lights hovered closer, their glow washing over me. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The lights blinked out, leaving the ridge in complete darkness. The hum disappeared, replaced by the deafening silence of the forest. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, staring up at the stars, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, I sat up, my body trembling. The campfire had burned low, casting faint shadows across the rocks. I scanned the sky, searching for any sign of the lights, but they were gone. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I'd fallen asleep and dreamed it. But the faint smell of ozone in the air told me otherwise. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, clutching my flashlight and knife, my eyes darting to every shadow, every rustling branch. The forest, which had felt so peaceful just hours before, now seemed alive with unseen movement. Every sound made my heart race. Every flicker of light sent a jolt of fear through me. When the first light of dawn broke over the ridge, I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear in record speed and started down the trail, my legs aching with every step. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the lights to reappear, but the sky remained clear. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. I threw my pack into the back of my car and sat there for a long moment, staring at the forest. Part of me wanted to go back, to try to figure out what I'd seen. But the larger part of me, the part that wanted to survive, told me to leave and never look back. I don't know what those lights were. Drones, planes, something else entirely. Whatever they weren't normal. I haven't been back to that ridge since, and I don't think I ever will. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Climbing mountains has always been my escape. The higher I go, the further I feel from the noise and chaos of everyday life. The crisp air, the rugged terrain, the sheer challenge of reaching the summit. It's addictive. But one climb changed everything for me, turning my sanctuary into a place I now approach with unease. This happened last summer. I'd planned a solo climb up a remote peak I'd been eyeing for a while. The trail was steep and unmarked, but I'd done my research. I knew the route, had the gear, and felt confident in my ability to tackle it alone. The peak wasn't well known, which meant no crowds, just me and the mountain. I set out early in the morning, my pack loaded with essentials. The first few hours were perfect. The trail was challenging but manageable, winding through dense pine forests and rocky outcrops. The higher I climbed, the more stunning the views became, with the valley below stretching out like a green quilt. I felt strong, alive, and completely at peace. Then, about halfway to the summit, I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A shadowy figure, standing on a ridge about 100 yards above me. It was just a brief glimpse, so brief that I wasn't even sure it was real. But it was enough to make me stop in my tracks. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but the figure was gone. Probably just another hiker, I muttered to myself, though the thought didn't sit right. This wasn't the kind of peak that attracted casual climbers. It was remote, steep, and not marked on most maps. Still, I tried to shake off the unease and kept climbing. But as I got closer to the ridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trail felt heavier somehow, the air colder. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. Each time, the path behind me was empty. When I reached the ridge, I stopped to catch my breath and scan the terrain. The trail ahead was narrow, with a steep drop on one side and a sheer rock face on the other. It was the kind of path that required your full attention, but my eyes kept darting to the surrounding cliffs, searching for any sign of the figure I'd seen earlier. That's when I spotted it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. A shadowy figure, perched on a rocky outcrop above me, completely still. It was too far away to make out any details, but its presence was unmistakable. My stomach twisted as I realized it wasn't moving, wasn't climbing. It was watching me. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing off the cliffs. The figure didn't respond. It didn't even flinch. It just stood there, dark and motionless against the bright blue sky. I stood frozen, torn between the urge to confront it and the primal instinct to get as far away as possible. Finally, I decided to keep climbing. Maybe it was just another climber, someone who'd taken a different route and was waiting at the summit. I told myself it was nothing to worry about, even though every nerve in my body was screaming otherwise. The higher I climbed, the worse the feeling got. The figure disappeared and reappeared several times, always just far enough away to make me question what I was seeing. Once, I thought I heard movement, rocks shifting, the crunch of gravel, but when I stopped to listen, there was only silence. When I finally reached the summit, the air was thin and cold, the wind whipping around me. I dropped my pack and sat down, trying to catch my breath and calm my nerves. The view was incredible. Peaks and valleys stretching out as far as the eye could see, but I couldn't enjoy it. My eyes kept darting to the surrounding cliffs, searching for any sign of the figure. It wasn't until I started my descent that things got worse. The first hour was uneventful, but then I saw the figure again, this time much closer. It was standing on the trail below me, partially obscured by the shadows of the cliffs. My heart pounded as I realized I'd have to pass it to continue down. "Hey!" I called out again, my voice trembling. "Are you okay?" No response. The figure didn't move. I took a deep breath and started down the trail, my legs shaking with every step. When I reached the spot where the figure had been, it was gone. The trail was empty, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest. From that point on, I couldn't focus. Every sound, every shadow, felt like a threat. I moved as quickly as I could, my eyes darting to the cliffs above me, searching for any sign of the figure. I slipped several times, scraping my hands and knees, but I didn't care. I just needed to get down. As I neared the tree line, I heard it. A low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. It was faint, almost like the wind, but unmistakably human. A groan, or maybe a growl, coming from somewhere above me. I didn't look back. I ran the rest of the way down, my pack bouncing against my shoulders, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I finally reached the trailhead, I collapsed against my car, my entire body trembling. I don't know what I saw on that mountain. A fellow hiker, a hallucination, something else. All I know is that it wasn't normal. I've climbed dozens of peaks since then, but I can't bring myself to return to that one. Whatever was up there, it didn't want me to leave, and I'm not sure I'd survive another encounter. Hiking loop trails always appealed to me. There's something satisfying about starting and ending at the same point, knowing you've completed a full circuit without retracing your steps. So, when I came across a description of a scenic loop trail in a remote wilderness area, I jumped at the chance to check it out. It was supposed to be a well-marked 15-mile trail with beautiful views and enough challenge to keep it interesting. I set out early in the morning, armed with a map, plenty of water, and a sense of excitement. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, cool air, and just enough breeze to keep the bugs away. The trail started off easy, winding through a dense forest of pines and aspens. I passed a few other hikers in the first hour or so, exchanging nods and brief hellos. But as I got deeper into the loop, I found myself completely alone. That's when things started to feel off. At first, it was subtle. The forest seemed too quiet, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves absent. The air felt heavier, the kind of stillness that makes you aware of your own breathing. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, and pressed on. But then, I noticed something strange. The trail, which had been clearly marked up to this point, started to fade. The path was still visible, but the markers, bright orange blazes nailed to trees, were fewer and farther between. I stopped to check my map, but it didn't make sense. The map showed a continuous loop, with no mention of forks or side trails. Yet here I was, standing at a split in the path, trying to decide which way to go. I chose the left fork, figuring it would eventually loop back to the main trail. At first, it seemed like the right choice. The path was narrow, but well-trodden, winding through the trees in a way that felt deliberate. I kept walking, glancing at my map every now and then to reassure myself. That's when I saw the cabin. It was small and weathered, almost hidden among the trees. There was no mention of it on the map, and I hadn't seen any signs pointing to it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped off the trail to take a closer look. The cabin was empty, its windows broken, and the door hanging open on rusted hinges. Inside, the floor was littered with leaves and debris, and the air smelled damp and musty. There was no furniture, no sign that anyone had been there recently, just an empty, forgotten structure in the middle of nowhere. I didn't stay long. Something about the place made me uneasy, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I stepped back onto the trail and kept walking, eager to put distance between myself and the cabin. But the further I went, the more the trail began to change. The ground became uneven, the dirt loose and crumbling under my boots. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a tangled canopy overhead that blocked out the sunlight. The path itself started to twist and turn in ways that didn't feel natural, like it was leading me deeper into the forest rather than back to the loop. I checked my map again, but it was useless. According to the map, I should have been back on the main trail by now. Instead, I was surrounded by trees, with no sign of the path I'd started on. That's when I realized I was lost. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I retraced my steps, trying to find the fork in the trail, but it was like the forest had swallowed it up. The more I walked, the more disoriented I became. Every tree looked the same, every turn identical to the last. I felt like I was walking in circles, even though I was certain I was moving in a straight line. Hours passed. The sun, which had been high in the sky when I started, was now sinking toward the horizon. The shadows grew longer, the forest darker. I tried to retrace my steps again, but nothing looked familiar. It was like the forest itself was shifting, changing the landscape around me. As night fell, the air grew colder, and I realized I'd have to stop. I found a small clearing and set up my emergency bivy sack, pulling it tight around me to keep out the chill. I built a small fire, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. I told myself I'd figure it out in the morning, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. This wasn't just a simple case of getting lost. The first night was the longest of my life. The forest, which had been so quiet during the day, came alive with sound after dark. I heard rustling in the bushes, the snap of twigs, and faint whispers that seemed to come from all around me. I clutched my flashlight and knife, my heart pounding with every noise. At one point, I thought I saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees, just at the edge of the firelight.
Hello?
I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, but the feeling of being watched never went away. When morning finally came, I wasted no time packing up and starting out again. I was determined to find the main trail, but the forest had other plans. The path I'd followed the day before was gone, replaced by a tangle of undergrowth and fallen branches. I pushed forward, using my compass to keep myself moving in one direction, but every step felt like a battle. Around midday, I stumbled into another clearing and froze. It was the cabin. At first, I thought it was a different one, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was the same. The same broken windows, the same rusted hinges, the same damp smell. I'd somehow ended up right back where I'd started, even though I was sure I'd been walking in a straight line. Panic set in. I turned around and started walking in the opposite direction, desperate to put distance between myself and the cabin. But no matter which way I went, I kept ending up in the same place. It was like the forest was toying with me, leading me in circles. By the second night, I was exhausted, cold, and terrified. I built another fire, this time in front of the cabin, and huddled beside it, clutching my knife. The whispers started again, louder this time, and I could have sworn I heard footsteps circling the clearing. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I decided to head straight for the rising sun. I didn't care if it wasn't the right direction. I just needed to get out of the forest. I walked for hours, the trees thinning slightly as I went. Finally, just as the sun was dipping low again, I stumbled onto the main trail. Relief washed over me as I recognized the familiar path. I practically ran the last few miles back to the trailhead, where my car was waiting. I didn't stop to rest or look back, afraid that if I did, I'd somehow end up back at the cabin. To this day, I don't know what happened on that loop trail. I've hiked dozens of times since then, but I've never gone back to that forest. Some places aren't meant to be found, and some trails aren't meant to be followed. Camping alone always felt like freedom to me. A break from the constant buzz of technology and noise, where it was just me, my tent, and the stars. I never imagined one trip would turn that peace into a haunting memory I'd never escape. Last fall, I decided to camp in a valley I'd read about online. The area was remote, but the photos looked stunning. Rolling hills, thick forests, and a crystal-clear river cutting through it all. I found a flat spot near the riverbank, pitched my tent, and started gathering wood for a fire. The solitude was perfect, the air crisp and clean. As night fell, I sat by the fire, listening to the crackle of the flames and the soothing rush of the river. The world felt peaceful, untouched. But then I noticed something strange. A section of the ground near the edge of my camp looked off. It was slightly raised, like someone had piled dirt there recently. Curious, I walked over and poked at it with a stick. The earth was loose, unlike the compacted soil around it. It looked like something had been buried there. I told myself it was probably just an animal cache. Maybe a raccoon or a bear had hidden food there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't belong. As the fire died down, I crawled into my tent, but sleep didn't come easily. The thought of that disturbed ground kept gnawing at me. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of movement outside. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the snap of a twig. It was digging. The soft, steady scrape of something clawing at the dirt. My heart pounded as I reached for my flashlight. I hesitated, every nerve in my body screaming to stay still, but curiosity won out. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. There was no one there. But the pile of dirt? It was bigger now, freshly disturbed. I froze, gripping the flashlight so tightly my hand ached. The digging sound had stopped, replaced by the rushing river and the whisper of the wind. I scanned the darkness, my heart racing, but I didn't see anything. I crawled back into the tent, too scared to move. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning finally came, I packed up as quickly as I could, not even bothering to make coffee. As I turned to leave, I glanced back at the pile of dirt. It looked larger. And the thought that something, or someone, had been digging there while I slept made my blood run cold. Hiking solo had always been my thing. There was something about the solitude, the connection to nature, and the quiet freedom that made it the perfect escape. That changed last summer. Now, I can't imagine hitting the trails alone, and I don't know if I ever will again. It was a multi-day trek through the mountains, a popular loop trail with incredible views. I'd chosen it specifically because of its reputation: safe, scenic, and well-traveled. The first day went off without a hitch. I made good time, enjoyed the lush greenery around me, and even spotted a herd of elk grazing in the distance. By the time I reached my planned campsite for the night, I felt like I'd hit the jackpot. The spot was gorgeous, a flat clearing with a panoramic view of the valley below. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, facing the horizon, so I could wake up to the sunrise. After setting up camp, I cooked some dinner over my portable stove and settled in to watch the sunset. The sky turned shades of pink and orange, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. That's when I first heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, just the sound of leaves crunching and twigs snapping somewhere in the distance. I brushed it off as a deer, or maybe another hiker heading to a nearby campsite. But as the footsteps got closer, they didn't sound like an animal. They were steady, deliberate, too heavy to belong to a deer. My heart started to race as I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the direction they were coming from. When I turned, I saw him. A man standing at the edge of the clearing, just inside the tree line. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. His face was in shadow, but I could make out his outline. He wasn't dressed like a hiker. No pack, no gear, just a tattered jacket and jeans. Something about him immediately felt wrong. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice calm. "Can I help you?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, silent, staring. I told myself he was probably just another camper, someone passing through. Maybe he was shy or lost, but deep down, I felt a prickle of unease. Something about the way he was standing, so still, made my stomach twist. "Are you okay?" I tried again, stepping a little closer. He tilted his head slightly, like he was studying me, but he didn't move. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked back into the trees without a word. I stayed frozen for a moment, watching the shadows where he'd disappeared. My rational mind told me he was probably harmless, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to pack up and leave. The problem was, it was already dark, and hiking back to the trail in the middle of the night was risky. I decided to stay put, but kept my flashlight and knife within arm's reach. That night was one of the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch, sent my heart racing. The forest seemed louder than usual, every sound amplified in the stillness. At one point, I thought I heard faint footsteps circling the clearing, but when I shone my flashlight into the trees, I didn't see anything. By the time the sun rose, I was exhausted, but relieved. I packed up my gear in record time, eager to put distance between myself and the campsite. As I stepped onto the trail, I glanced back at the clearing one last time. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in the trees, a shadow darting behind a trunk. But I told myself it was just my imagination. The second day of hiking was uneventful at first. The trail wound through dense forest, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. I tried to shake off the events of the night before, focusing on the beauty around me. But as the hours passed, that prickle of unease crept back in. I started to feel like I was being followed. At first, it was just a feeling, that weird sensation of eyes on your back. But then I started hearing things. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching, the faint sound of footsteps. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the trail behind me was always empty. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. "You're just spooking yourself." But when I stopped to refill my water bottle at a small stream, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the mud by the water's edge, was a single set of footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and pointed in the same direction I was heading. Someone had been here recently. Someone was close. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding with every step. The trail grew steeper as it climbed toward the next campsite, and my legs burned with the effort, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get somewhere safe, somewhere with other hikers. When I reached the second campsite, it was empty. I set up my tent quickly, choosing a spot close to the trail in case I needed to leave in a hurry. As the sun set, I kept scanning the trees, searching for any sign of movement. The forest was quiet, too quiet, and every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I didn't bother with a fire that night. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Instead, I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tight, clutching my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of heavy breathing. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Deep, labored breaths, coming from right outside my tent. My blood turned to ice as I realized someone was standing there, just inches away. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I held my breath, listening, every muscle in my body tense. The breathing stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps moving away. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore, then unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The campsite was empty, but I didn't feel alone. I didn't wait for morning. I packed up my gear in the dark and started hiking back toward the trailhead. My flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow path ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. By the time I reached the trailhead, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. I threw my pack into the back of my car and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the trail one last time and froze. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was the man. He was watching me, his face still hidden in shadow. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I hit the gas and sped away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. Even now, I can still see him in my mind, standing there like he was waiting for something. I haven't hiked solo since that trip. The wilderness used to be my escape, but now it feels like a place where you're never really alone. There's an unspoken rule in hiking: stick to the trail. I've followed that rule religiously, knowing that the wilderness doesn't forgive mistakes. But on one particular trip, curiosity got the better of me, and it's a decision I still regret. It started as an ordinary weekend hike. I was exploring a remote area I'd read about in a guidebook, a trail that wound through dense forest and eventually climbed to a ridge with panoramic views. The hike was supposed to take 2 days, with a simple out-and-back route to a small campsite near a creek. The first day was perfect. The trail was quiet, the forest alive with birdsong, and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I reached the campsite in the late afternoon, set up my tent, and spent the evening sitting by the creek, enjoying the solitude. It was one of those rare moments when everything felt right with the world. The next morning, I decided to explore a bit before heading back. My map showed nothing unusual, just a straightforward trail leading back to the parking lot. But as I packed up my gear, I noticed something in the distance, a faint path branching off from the main trail. It wasn't marked, and it wasn't on my map. Still, it piqued my curiosity. I hesitated. I'd always been cautious about straying from marked trails, but something about this path intrigued me. It looked well-trodden, as if others had taken it before. I figured it couldn't hurt to follow it for a short distance, just to see where it led. The first few minutes felt like an adventure. The path was narrow, winding through tall pines and ferns, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. The forest was beautiful, untouched, and completely silent. I kept walking, expecting to stumble upon a scenic overlook or a hidden creek. Instead, I found the cabin. It was small, almost hidden among the trees, its weathered wood blending into the forest. The roof sagged slightly, and the windows were dark. At first, I thought it was abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. It was too intact, too deliberate. It didn't belong here. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to approach. My gut told me to turn around, but my curiosity won out. Slowly, I stepped closer, the crunch of leaves under my boots sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. The door was slightly ajar, hanging on rusted hinges. I pushed it open, the wood creaking as it swung inward. The air inside was cool and stale, carrying the faint smell of damp wood and decay. The interior was sparse, a single room with a table, a chair, and a small wood stove in the corner. The walls were bare, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust and leaves. But what struck me most was the table. In the center of the table was a single candle, unlit, but surrounded by wax drippings that suggested it had been used recently. Next to the candle was a piece of paper, yellowed with age. I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly. Scrawled across it in shaky handwriting were 2 words: "Don't stay." My heart skipped a beat. I glanced around the room, half expecting someone to step out of the shadows, but it was empty. The windows, though grimy, allowed just enough light to confirm that I was alone, or so I thought. As I turned to leave, I heard a noise, a faint creak, like the sound of a footstep. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The noise came again, louder this time, followed by a soft rustling. My mind raced. Was someone outside? Or worse, inside with me? "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I stepped outside, scanning the clearing. The forest was still, the trees casting long shadows in the midday sun. But the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. My skin prickled, and my heartbeat thundered in my ears. I decided I'd had enough. I turned back toward the path, ready to leave the cabin behind. But as I retraced my steps, the path seemed different. The trees felt closer, the undergrowth denser. I could no longer see the faint trail I'd followed to get there. Panic started to creep in. I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving. The main trail couldn't be far, but as I walked, the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The cabin had disappeared from sight, but its presence lingered in my mind. Then, I heard the whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, a soft murmur weaving through the trees. But as I stopped to listen, the sound grew clearer. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Words, faint but distinct, carried on the breeze. Don't stay. My blood ran cold. It was the same message as the note on the table. But this time, it wasn't written. It was spoken. And it was coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, my eyes darting through the trees. There was no one there. The forest was empty, silent except for the pounding of my heart. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. No answer. I started walking faster, my eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the trail. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from every direction, surrounding me. My steps turned into a jog, then a run, as I desperately tried to escape the sound. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing and froze. It was the cabin. I stared at it, my mind racing. I had been walking in a straight line. There was no way I could have ended up back here. Yet there it was, exactly as I'd left it, the door still ajar. A wave of nausea washed over me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on me like a weight. Slowly, I backed away, keeping my eyes on the cabin as I edged toward the trees. And then, I saw it. A figure in the window. It was faint, almost shadowy, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was standing inside, watching me. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I turned and ran, tearing through the undergrowth, not caring about the noise I made. My only goal was to get as far away as possible. The forest seemed endless, but eventually, I stumbled onto the main trail. Relief flooded over me as I recognized the path. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead, my lungs burning and my legs aching. When I got home, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I scoured maps and online forums, looking for any mention of the cabin, but found nothing. It was as if it didn't exist. Even now, I can't explain what I saw or heard that day. The cabin, the whispers, the figure in the window. It all felt too real to be a hallucination. But one thing is certain. I'll never stray from the trail again.